Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for listening today. Let's continue our discussion about the most profound lesson ever taught to me by my father, the wisest man I ever met in my life, a third grade dropout. My dad, more wise than any professor I ever had in college, wiser than any coach, teacher, mentor, this third grade dropout who grew up in rural Texas, who taught lessons that when I was a child, frankly, I took for granted. Now, in my 60s, I hold on with dear life to each of these lessons. Lessons like, son, don't judge people. Everyone is worthy of dignity. No one is beneath you. Judge no one. Lessons like, son, you'd rather be an hour early than a minute late. I can hear Aristotle, the great Aristotle, saying you are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act. That is what my father was saying. You'd rather be an hour early, son, than a minute late. Lessons like, son, be kind to people. Kind deeds are never lost. Lessons like, son, make sure your servant's towel is bigger than your ego. Ego is the anesthesia that deadens the pain of stupidity. Pride is the burden of a foolish person. Lessons like, son, if you're going to do a job, do it right. Grammatically, I know it's not correct. I know it ought to be do it well, but message landed. If I'm going to do something, do it to the best of my ability. What my father was saying was how you do anything is how you do everything, that it's never wrong to do the right thing. But the greatest lesson my father ever taught me was, son, just stand. Just stand. Just stand. You know what? He taught me that lesson on the 12th day of September, 1996, as me and my young son stood in front of the casket of my first wife and their mommy. My father said 3 words that would change my life. Son, just stand. The lesson is profound in its simplicity, life-changing in its application. This episode represents part 4 of our discussion to simply stand. My father demanded that I stand, even when I didn't think that I could. He motivated me to keep pushing forward, even when I didn't see any way possible. And so my hope, my prayer is that these simple words from a third grade dropout will meet you right where you are this day, regardless of what you may be facing, regardless of what you may be dealing with. For the ultimate goal is to keep standing. Something that my dad practiced his entire life, something that World War II generation practiced, something that the people of this great country have been practicing for hundreds of years. I happen to be recording this series around the time that we observe the national holiday commemorating the birthday of civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. April 4th, 1968, shortly after 6 o'clock, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel, Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And just days following the assassination of Dr. King, Michigan Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill requesting that King's birthday be declared a national holiday. And on November 2nd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed that bill into law, not only establishing King's birthday as a holiday, but forever cementing his legacy as one of the most transformative figures in the history of the world. Martin Luther King Jr. stood. He stood for racial equality and social justice. Friends, one man stood, and his courage to just simply stand influenced an entire generation. His convictions challenged a divided nation. His actions transformed men and women worldwide. King's life, I think, can be summed up in one word: stand. You see, rarely is standing convenient or popular or in style. In fact, when King came on the scene in 1955, oh boy, He was facing a mountain that seemed impossible to climb. Let's go back to Montgomery, 1955. Montgomery, Alabama. America was at a racial crossroads, but history would be altered when one man encouraged many to stand. Often, that conviction is produced by an exigence. An exigence, denotatively defined as an imperfection marked by an urgency. So an exigence can be personal, like a health issue or a financial crisis. Or in the case of Martin King, the exigence is social, societal. Racial unrest had been building for hundreds of years in America, but one man chose to stand in Montgomery, Alabama, then known as the cradle of the Confederacy. But let's go back a few hundred years, because I think it's really important for us to realize our country has been built on men and women of every ethnicity choosing to stand. I'm going to pick it up with the American slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade from the 16th to the 19th centuries. You know, America was rural and agrarian. Labor becomes the justification for slavery. We have 12 million people, mostly from West Africa, that came unwillingly to the United States. 2 million roughly died en route. It's important to note that they did not come as slaves. They came as kings and queens and village leaders and chiefs and tribal leaders and medical doctors. Families were destroyed. Histories were lost. Dignities were shattered. Slave labor built a plantation economy, mostly with crops like sugar and cotton, tobacco and coffee. Here were the effects. Slavery was morally devastating. We know that. Spiritually debilitating. We know that. Slavery was established in silence. It was known as, quote, a necessary evil, end quote, as the claims of colored people were suppressed. However, because people stood throughout our history, we started to see change. Not real fast, but a change here, a subtle change there. In colonial America, slavery moved slowly from a necessary evil to a positive good, at least according to the masters of the day. But still, America was gripped with a colonialism as whites talked to other whites about the roles of people of color. Men talked to other men about the roles of women. Friends, in 2025, we still have some of those vestiges of colonialism today. The institution of slavery was not in the best interest of the slaves, and some, black and white, began to stand against slavery. I'm talking about people like Nat Turner, people like Harriet Tubman. I'm talking about people that weren't, quote, colored, end quote. White abolitionists like John Brown, who considered himself an instrument of God, raised to strike a blow against slavery. What about a pastor by the name of Wendell Phillips, a white pastor who became president of the American Anti-Slavery Society? Oh, by the way, he spoke at John Brown's funeral. John Brown was killed because of his defense for integration, because of his charge against slavery. John Brown was killed, and at Brown's funeral, Pastor Wendell Phillips said these words, quote, "Some men struggle into obscurity, while other men forget themselves into immortality." Wow. John Brown was killed because of what he believed. A third-grade dropout daddy who spent all of his life challenging me to stand said this to me on one occasion: "Son, if you have nothing to die for, you have nothing to live for." Another white abolitionist who stood, William Lloyd Garrison, one of my personal heroes. He was a journalist who published an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison also supported the rights of women. In fact, he was a prominent voice in the women's suffrage movement in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so I'm setting the stage to feature Martin Luther King in the 1950s, But in order to really build that stage, we need to understand that history reveals that every generation had men and women who bucked the tide, men and women who dared to stand against all odds. I think about our revolutionary heritage. I think about Ben Franklin. I think about Paul Revere shouting out that the British are coming. I think about great men and women who would dare stand. I think about Sojourner Truth. I think about all the great people throughout history who said, no matter what, we're going to stand. And as we push toward the 1950s, think about this. Think about all the people who stood during the assimilationist period of America. W.E.B. Du Bois in the 20th century said that at least we have 10% of Negroes who go to university, and his philosophy, called the talented 10th, was good, but it was also challenged. It was challenged by another educator who stood by the name of Booker T. Washington, who thought that, quote, all Negroes ought to get a general education. Listen to these folks who stood. Marcus Garvey in the 20th century. He was the head of this organization called the United Negro Improvement Association. How about A. Philip Randolph, who stood in 1925 when he established the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters? How about Adam Clayton Powell, one of the first few Negro congressmen in 1945? In the field of sports, Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in 1947. Long before Tiger Woods, there was Charlie Sifford, first African-American golfer in 1951. How about this? How about a man that was denied going to law school in his home state of Maryland? So he goes about an hour away to Howard University, gets a law degree, starts trying cases, splinter cases, one by one, that led to Brown versus Board of Education, May 17th, 1954. Brown versus Board of Education was argued by Thurgood Marshall, Howard University. It was a landmark case. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. Brown said separate and equal facilities, unconstitutional. One man standing. How about Fannie Lou Hamer, who challenged America by saying, is this truly America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? How about Ella Baker? How about Joanna Robinson and the Women's Political Council? There were many who stood that, we may not know their names, but that doesn't mean that decades, centuries of histories in America record people who stood. We have people who stood in the Negro Baseball League, in jazz music, in education, medicine, the law. How about the arts? How about Bessie Smith? How about Nat King Cole? How about a white president named Harry Truman? This was an unpopular decision in 1948, but President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 with one stroke of the pen. The United States Air Force, along with all other branches of service, were integrated. Friends, many have stood, and here's the point. When one dares to stand, the impact on others is seismic. We're going to pick it right up, right there, the next time we're together. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, let me ask the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.